Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Star Wars Stuff Podcast, where we talk all things Star Wars. My name is Colin.
I'm an international man of mystery.
I'm Hunter.
I'm Christian.
I'm Cap. I'm Star.
Okay, all right. So, man, I really wish Josh was here. It would be great to hear from him.
Yeah, I don't know who this man of mystery guy is.
Yeah, very, very
pretty
mysterious.
cool to me, just saying.
All I know is he's not Batman.
And we are back with another episode of the Prop Pod segment, and we're going to be talking about weathering. The weathering. That was
the weathering.
Yes, the weathering.
The
that
weathering.
was one of the first things I heard from Star when like they came out to Epcot and stuff for the first time, like on Star Wars Day trip like last year of 2023 as well. But yeah, Hunter actually did an entire seminar, a panel over.
I don't know if I call it a seminar.
I like it.
Okay,
That
well,
makes it sound way too official.
well, guess what,
Oh,
buddy?
lecture.
You had a whole PowerPoint, so
Yeah, I gave a presentation on weathering this past summer at DroidCon, which was fun. Went a lot better than drunk PowerPoint nights talking about Boba Fett. So that was good.
You take that back.
So before we get started, we wanted to say thank you to everyone on Patreon. And we have a lot more stuff to that we're adding to Patreon. Check out all of our Clone Wars stuff we're doing on there. All the links will be at the end of the podcast. But before we get started, let's talk about what all the projects that we're all currently working on. Wow. Okay. I'm not going to say start with Cap just because of the face.
Well, look, my major project is a dissertation. So if I touch my Master Chief helmet, it is lucky. So yeah. No, it's still sitting in the garage, so I haven't done anything since last week, sadly.
For me, I just got done with my first commission. I ship it out tomorrow.
Yay.
One. Yeah.
Awesome.
And then right now I'm currently weathering my my Anakin Clone Wars armor because Cap and I have a photo shoot tomorrow, so
Woo!
that's gonna be fun. But yeah, that's the main stuff I'm working on. Josh,
Drinking coffee and painting Warhammer.
that's fantastic, dude.
You sound so
Great
excited
work.
about that.
Dog, I had everything done. I have a tournament next week.
Next
week. And I was like, I'm going to get these models done. And that's all I'm going to do. And then I finished them. And I was like, I could do 3 more. And now I'm concerned I won't be able to. We're going to see how well this plan works out. I don't want to play the game with half-painted models because then the paint's just going to like chip off and get damaged during handling. So it's either they're unprimed or they're fully painted and cleared. And so it's going to be a rush job.
All right, Christian.
I just last night finished building also a Warhammer 40k army to get started.
Hell yeah, you are.
But then I have a giant leatherworking project that's currently sitting and waiting for me to get stitching on because it's an entire chest plate and back plate with shoulders, band braces, and thigh armor. And then I have a bunch of Star Wars stuff just lying around waiting for me to get back to working on it at some point. I have a fully resin printed E11 sitting on my shelf right now, just waiting to be worked on.
Hunter?
I mean, I won't go through every half-finished project in my garage. But this week I have mostly been working on my RX droid. I have been designing the internal mechanism to get all 4 axes of motion for the head. And I finally got that all assembled and got them actually paired to the receiver or the transmitter, and moving on the Monday night, I think it was Monday night. Other than that, I've been working on a Vader helmet commission, which the gloss 2K code on that has just been the bane of my existence. It turned out so great, and then there was like a couple flecks of dust in it. So I'm wet sanding it now, and then I'm going to try and buff it back up and see how it looks. And if that doesn't work, then I just got to sand it back down and re-clear coat it.
Oh,
Yep.
Such a blast.
Yeah.
I still maintain that you should tell your client what I said.
Yeah, that's. I mean, honestly, the Return of the Jedi is probably the nicest helmet that we see in the original trilogy. It's the most glossy. It's a shame that this isn't the A New Hope helmet, because the A New Hope helmet kind of looks like garbage. It's so beat up and not anywhere close to gloss.
Oh yeah, if you look at that helmet, you can see where there's like handprints from people.
Yeah. Vader didn't have his little ball thing yet, so
No.
Right.
he had a poor officer that had to take it on and off him.
Star, what are you working on?
Oh man. Projects wise, I'm actually making a quilt right now, so lots of sewing. But not really like, yeah.
I recently just learned how to sew, so I might have to pick.
You want to make a quilt, Colin? Come make a quilt with me.
Maybe.
It's like hard pass.
Yeah, maybe. Cool. All right. Well, let's dive into the world of weathering. What the beginning process is like. I know diving to every project, it's like you have to have a different approach, because there are costumes like Boba Fett and Commander Cody that have like precise like things on there that have to be perfect. And then you have the freedom with like your custom Mandos, where you can do whatever, and with custom droids as well. So it's not just costumes, it's like props, droids, blasters, like you name it. It's going to look better if you put some weathering to it, unless it's supposed to be shiny. If it's supposed to be shiny, leave it shiny. But yeah, Hunter, can you talk about what that beginning process is like of picking the project to kind of get into that weathering process?
Yeah. I like to call the way you think about it weathering theory. And for starters too, we're gonna ramble through a podcast about weathering. But some really great resources out there. Our friend, not this Colin, a different Colin, Odd Viking, is his handle on Instagram and YouTube. He has a really great series of videos where he talks about weathering and stuff, and those are fantastic. And he covers some of the same stuff we'll talk about today too. But particularly, he's got a really great video on weathering theory. And that's something that I think is also really, really important. And by weathering theory, I mean thinking about how and why and where objects are going to get dirty, because your weathering should make sense. A really good way to kind of understand this is if you go out into the real world, you can look at like cars or heavy machinery are often really good places to look at this, because they get a lot of wear and tear. But you can pay attention to where the dirt builds up, where the paint chips, what type of dirtiness is on an object, and where that dirtiness may be from. And then go from there and use that as inspiration for your props or costumes or whatever. So like kind of the general points I like to tell people when it comes to weathering theory is like stuff likes to build up in crevices or recesses, and then stuff is often worn away on high points. Mm-hmm. And those are kind of the most basic ways to think about it. And then on top of that too, you can think about like how materials are layered and stuff. So like if there's a paint chip, it's going to expose the coat of paint underneath that. Boba Fett is the best example of that in all of Star Wars. He has so many different layers of color on every segment of his armor, but especially the Empire Strikes Back helmet. He has, like, if you look at it, you can see there is the top green layer, and then underneath that there's, well, depending on which segment of the helmet, there's either gray or like that cement looking color, and then there's the silver underneath. So like that kind of, like, the logic behind it is meant to be like there's silver, and then on top of that there was the primer coat, and then that kind of sandy brown, and then the green. And when the green gets chipped away, that's going to be the biggest area because that's the top. And then you see the sandy color underneath. And then underneath that, there's the primer. And then underneath that, there's the silver, which is meant to be your base metal or whatever. So all that kind of stuff is super important to think about. And yeah, just pay attention to, like, again, where you're weathering, and the fact that it shouldn't really be even across the whole part. It's going to vary across whatever you're weathering, because not everything comes into contact with other objects or the elements in the same way.
And another thing about weathering theory, I think, is that, the idea is to make it look in universe and lived in, especially when you're thinking about the original trilogy. The time that folks were watching the original trilogy, you had a bunch of other sci-fi shows and movies, coming out, like Star Trek. Everything in Star Trek is super stark, super clean. And the difference with Star Wars is that you've got this really dirty kind of lived in look where there's grime and sand and whatever. And so when you're thinking about weathering props, armor, other costumes, to match sort of the Star Wars style, you want to think about, like, kind of how to make it dirty. That doesn't mean everything's like super dirty. You do have some crisp kind of costumes. Like if you think about Jango Fett, right? That's a much cleaner look than Boba Fett, but still, it's not this pristine, just perfect costume. There's still some weathering bits to it. So I think the idea here is you're trying to make it in, which is what Hunter's explaining here.
Yeah.
And there's, if I may interject, there's also a really clear point where there's also a story to be told on things where there isn't weathering.
Yes.
Because you look at the original TKs, you look at the, Imperial ships, you look at the Death Star, you look at the Star Destroyers, those are pristine.
Yes.
Those are clean.
Yeah.
Because those are maintained to a higher than standard level of efficiency, because they are expected to be a certain level of cleanliness. Whereas you look at, the X-Wings versus TIE Fighters are pristine, fresh paint job. The kind of thing where, like, if you dinged it when you were parking it, you would go out and repaint it the same day. Whereas an X-Wing, you're going to fly it wherever it's going to hit something and go, it's fine. Yeah.
Yeah. You said exactly what I was going to say. Like, there's definitely a story to clean stuff too.
Yeah.
Like 3PO, he's
Yeah.
he's kind of a wuss and doesn't get his hands dirty.
Wow.
And then you have R2, and R2 gets all kinds of buildup and stuff. A really cool example of R2 is on Dagobah, when he is just totally crusted with mud. Yeah. And that's a cool, like, environmental thing. It only makes sense on Dagobah. It wouldn't make sense for him on Tatooine or on the Death Star to get mud on him, but it makes sense because he's on Dagobah. So if you're doing a custom Mando or something, people kind of have a theme for their armor. Like, oh yeah, this person was like, they have camouflage armor or something, like they've been in the woods or the swamp or whatever. So it makes sense to have mud and stuff. Whereas if you're mostly a pilot, that type of dirtiness isn't going to be as prevalent.
Yeah. We might get more oil stains on that.
Right. And there's also a phrase, I'm not sure if we said it yet, but less is more. It just depends on what you're trying to do. So for my Mando, I've got like some like parts where like it's not like, there's some weathering like on one pauldron and then the other one is just rusty as hell. Like it's like, completely rusty. And it just depends on the project, but sometimes that kind of clean, slightly weathered look looks good, but it really just depends on what you're going for.
Yeah. I think that kind of makes me think of, you were talking about like one being dirty and one not being, like the asymmetry of weathering. So there is kind of a common thing that people actually understand in brain science where humans, they're able to recognize patterns and replicate them. So it's a patterning instinct. And basically, if you just give someone like a random paintbrush and you say, hey, make stars or something, or make weathering, chances are they will actually make things that are like evenly spaced apart or that replicate on the other side. Maybe not perfectly, but it will not actually appear too random.
Just
so
like
actually
on accident,
on accident, people will like repeat stuff. And so sometimes with weathering, to make things look randomized, actually sometimes it's not good to just trust your brain. And so trying to like think about, oh, I'm purposely making this asymmetrical rather than just kind of trusting your brain to come up with that itself, because it might actually come up with something that looks too planned. Keeping that in mind. So
yeah, brains aren't good at weathering.
no.
yeah, it's actually really hard.
Yeah.
Nature is good at weathering. Brains
Yes.
not so much.
Well, but and that's back to like the term. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm a political scientist. I like to define terms, but like when we're thinking about
Nerd.
well, shut up. The point is, the word. It's like, okay, what if this thing was exposed to the elements, whatever those are? So if you're thinking about, whatever your prop is, whatever your, it could be a TK, in which case maybe you're not exposed to the elements. If it's a Mando and you're a custom Mando and they're hiking around in the swamp, then yeah, they're gonna have dirt all over. So weathering, that's the point.
And if you're trying to recreate, weathering that exists in a show or a movie, then someone's already done some of that thinking for you, and then you get to kind of try to replicate that. Whereas if you're doing like a custom build, that's where it kind of becomes a little bit more important to think about randomizing and asymmetrical things. And I don't know, like for me, sometimes I just like flicking paint on something, not that is going to be what is the end goal, but it tells me, oh, there's a random splotch there, that's where I'm going to work, rather than like letting my brain come up with it. But
yeah, I'm sure I'll talk about Boba Fett a lot on this episode.
Yeah,
but,
for some reason I think you will.
Boba does actually have a slightly different, well, it's kind of like a gray green olive mix of a really wet paint that's flicked on to sort of like a splatter in areas, and you cannot see it on screen. You have to be like right up looking at the helmet if it's in a museum exhibit or something, but it's like a thing that's there, and you get this like I don't know, your brain kind of, when it can't actually pick out those little speckles or whatever, it's like from far away your brain kind of evens it out to a gradient or whatever, and you get kind of a, like, I don't know, not a faded look, but like the opposite of a faded look.
I get what you're saying.
You get like your view of it from like the standpoint of being like an audience member is a little fuzzier because you're looking at it not from like a hyper detail.
Yeah,
you're looking at it from the 10-foot distance, right?
Yeah.
Which like it's something I think about a lot when I think about weathering for costumes and props, which is I think about like, okay, this is like if I'm holding a blaster, right? Okay, where is it going to get hit the most?
Yeah.
Where is it not going to get hit the most? Parts that are going to be the cleanest are probably going to be the parts I'm handling. So like the handle of it's going to be worn down pretty smooth, but there's going to be parts of it where I'm just like, I have never cleaned this part of the gun. Oops. And like just for last Dragon Con, I had a new backplate on my Mando, and because I just been upgrading slowly parts to metal armor. And I was kind of like, well, I mean, like my old backplate had a scratch running down the back of it because I had done the thing where I was thinking about how, like, a jetpack would hook onto it and it would rub down a certain spot consistently if you were hooking it on and off. There's no mounting points for that, but I could do a thing where it's like, oh, what if I slid on my back? So I actually just took the back plate, went down into the parking lot of my apartment complex, put my foot on it, and just scratched it across the cement, and then picked it up and went, neat, and then walked back home.
Yeah,
nice.
There's sometimes where just thinking about how you want the weathering to look means it's not random, but it's not a pattern.
Yep. And sometimes you can get weathering. This sounds dumb. Sometimes you can get weathering by actually weathering it. Like what Christian just said. If you want damage, just damage it. I mean, why not? If it got slide it, I don't know.
I think that brings us into, I guess, the other half of what we were going to talk about tonight, like how you actually do it.
Yeah.
And that's a really good way to go about it. for sure, you do have to be aware of what your base material is.
Yes.
So you don't just wreck your
Stuff.
yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
like
So-
my Mando armor is metal, and I was able to be really rough with that. I have videos of me taking a bunch of metal junk I have and literally just chucking it at it because it's aluminum, so it's not gonna like crack the plate or whatever. But if that was a resin piece or something, it would have just destroyed it.
Yeah. Yeah. So here's my question. So now that Colin's gone, I'm just gonna like throw these questions at you guys.
Oh, God.
So I want to talk about like what you're weathering, because like different materials, like Hunter just mentioned, like you have to weather them very differently. Like, I mean, kind of duh, but like maybe everyone can pick a material they like working with and just tell us like how do you weather that? So be it plastic or cloth or metal, foam, leather, whatever. How do you weather this material?
Mm-hmm. Well, I just went and grabbed 2 helmets off my shelf.
Nice.
To show a little bit back to like the thinking of like the props. But like, so this is my fiance's former Twi'lek Mandalorian helmet.
Nice.
Which is a former helmet because it suffered a pretty nasty fall.
Ooh.
But one of the things that like the process of physical weathering was that you can just see it here. We were thinking on the whole armor motif, you know, something that evokes a loth wolf.
Mm-hmm.
And they have the big 3 front claws. So I went, well, what if you actually got like scratched up by something like that? And she went, what do you mean? And then I took an actual hacksaw and
Nice.
started sawing into the helmet.
Yeah.
Nice.
And then when I tell you the amount of stress that caused her to see me there just go at a helmet with a saw and not bat an eye at it, that's just a part of it. Because then it's okay, this will inform how the weathering on the rest of the paint goes and how the rest of the scratches develop.
And is that a 3D print?
This is a solid resin print.
Okay, so that's resin. Okay.
This is resin, yeah.
Yep.
Which means
Okay.
you can actually cut into it. Whereas
Yep.
if it was like a filament print, you could only maybe do the couple of top layers.
Well, so I did a similar thing with this helmet. So this one's a 3D print. I also gave it the scratch marks because that's, you know, canon for Cal. I had to be really careful because cutting into this one, you know, you could melt really easily. So these are actually pretty shallow. So a kind of a similar thing. Yeah.
That can be kind of a good way to go about it, though. If you want, like, you can use a soldering iron or whatever to melt the score in plastic. I've done that a lot. I guess if you want us to talk about favorite materials, I guess I like weathering plastic just because it's the most versatile. But I think there's a lot of stuff that applies to all types of different materials. Like your paint techniques are going to be the same, or your whatever. Like you're going to still layer on paint and do the paint chipping the same way. Your washes are still going to be basically the same. And for those that don't know, washes, because I think we all kind of talk about it because we paint stuff all the time, but it's not necessarily like something everybody knows. Washes are just a watered down or diluted paint. So I usually use acrylic washes, and it's literally just acrylic paint and water and or alcohol in there. You can do it with oils and other solvents. Josh really likes oil paints and that kind of thing. But it's really like personal preference. And washes are, because it's a thin down paint, like you don't put it on and it's fully opaque. You put it on and it's kind of translucent, and then you wipe it off and it leaves it in those crevices because it's thinned down. So it's a good way to get like your general coating.
And what about the paint chipping? You do this a lot with the latex. Do you want to tell us about it?
Oh, yeah. You can use like masking fluid. Some people use toothpaste. I use latex because I have a bunch, and Hunter's showing you an example here.
Yes.
This is
So
kind of
how does this work? If I wanted to do this, what would I do?
Hunter kind of went over this at the beginning, in just that you put your base coat down of like what you want your like base material to be, whether that's like metal if you're doing a Mando or and then you just put your masking fluid on where you want it to show through, paint your next layer on, and when you I don't know, weather it back off, rub it back off with your finger, whatever, it'll reveal the color underneath your detail or your next coat. And Hunter was saying that's a lot with what Boba Fett has.
Yeah.
A lot of a lot of layers. So many. So yeah, I really like that method. I use that a lot.
Yeah.
For plastic, we've got kind of like you can score it if you want to actually make physical like cuts, in your armor. You can use that. The latex method where you're kind of peeling back paint layers. You use washes. So what else for plastic?
Dry brushing is another really good one, and this applies to everything because it's like an additive paint method. Dry brushing, it's kind of like what it sounds like. You get paint on a paintbrush or something else, and then rub most of it off, so you're not gonna like glob it on in a wet looking shape, but just enough so there's still paint on there, but you're going to be really gentle with the way you apply it, and it kind of leads to a brush look. Yeah, so that Cap is showing off their Hunter helmet, and the Bad Batch characters have all this awesome like hand-painted look, and you can get that by building up dry brushing, which is super awesome.
Yeah.
On this helmet here, this Captain Vaughn one, which I apologize to anybody who's just listening to this episode.
It's very visual today.
You'll see these black scuffs on here, and those are kind of present on some larger faces, but also on edge points as well, where it is like I said, take a little bit of paint on a paintbrush and then wipe most of it off on paper towel, and then just very lightly kind of drag the tip of the paintbrush over that area. I also really like to use a Scotch-Brite pad. And then I tear it so you get a really funky ragged edge. And then you can use that as your dry brushing. Some people like sponges. I find sponges it's like they hold too much paint, if that makes sense. And there's like more empty space in the fibers of a Scotch-Brite pad, which is why I switched to them.
I think sponges work great if you're using more like a wax-based metallic, like Rub and Buff. Because that one, that one helps a lot. Because that way you get a more consistent pressure application on it.
Yeah, Rub and Buff.
I love Scotch-Brite for a lot of weathering stuff.
Yeah, that made me think of something we should probably talk about. You can, like I mentioned, that Boba Fett style of that layered look. There's multiple ways to achieve that. You can do it with the latex and start with your silver, mask that off, and then build up from there. So that's your your actual layered method, or you can do it all topically too. So like my Mandalorian armor, my custom Mando, the chest armor on that, and the other metal parts were actual subtractive weathering to get down to the base metal and the underlying colors. But the helmet, because that wasn't metal, I couldn't weather it the same way, but I still wanted to get the same look, and all of that silver on the helmet is done topically. So applying your paints topically is the other way to approach it. So that's kind of like the inverse of the layered method. So you'd do your base coat of whatever the largest like color patch is, and then from there you would do then your next one, and then your next one, and then you end with what would theoretically be the base coat, so like your silver or whatever. It's more about the final look and like the shape of those chips and stuff than it is how you actually apply them.
Yeah.
Which I think is true for a lot of weathering, is that, you're going for a particular look. Don't get too hung up on doing the process exactly right. Aim for like the end product. Yeah. You can also sand, right? So we've done that with some of our Bad Batch armor. We clear coated the like bottom layer, and then sanded down kind of to that.
Yeah, like that. I actually, I really like using steel wool for that actually. And like sometimes I'll even put paint on the steel wool to do like two things at once. So you're getting like the brushed look, but also getting scratches underneath.
Yeah, that's
I don't know. I really like doing that.
exactly why I love the Scotch. I use Scotch-Brite pads so much, specifically the red ones, because they're
It's the same thing.
They're a
Same.
little bit. Yes.
Sorry, didn't know what Scotch-Brite was.
Oh, okay. So yeah, I guess I should explain it. If anyone doesn't, Scotch-Brite's like a name. It's like Kleenex for like the Kleenex name brand, but for it's like a scouring pad basically. But they come in different grits, and they're oftentimes used for metals specifically because you can get like a brushed look with them. But they're unabrasive, so you can use it to take paint and stuff off as well. And just like what Cap and Star were saying, I will do that as my last pass and just do a high level sanding. Like I'll apply a wash over everything and get it kind of a little bit more dirty than I'd actually want everywhere. And then I'll hit it with the Scotch-Brite pad, and that will naturally hit the high points and clean those up, which is kind of how it works in real life. And then it leaves the dirtiness and the crevices and stuff.
Okay, so we got a bit on sort of how do you weather plastic, maybe also kind of metal. What about stuff like leather and cloth? I know that Josh has been learning about leather. So how do you weather leather? For
a lot of the leatherworking stuff that I do, it starts as veg tan leather and then you dye it to whatever color you want it to end up being. There's a lot of ways. You can do acrylics, you can do oils. The thing with leather is it's a flexible, porous material at its heart. So you can't, like, enamels or things that will crack when you try and bend them is not the smartest idea to try and use. But there's like specific things. There's like leather, I think it's called like aging cream or something, where it's this really dark. I think it's from Tandy.
Right? It's called antiquing.
Yeah, antiquing, whatever.
Yeah.
Some weird like toothpaste from hell, but it gets dark stuff onto the high points, which is something that happens a lot, especially with things that are handled by people like that have dirty hands. So a lot of like, cowboys with leather goods, or me with my car, like all of the stuff that people grab a lot are going to get caked in black and dark browns and get really, really dirty. So sometimes there are aspects where we've been talking a lot with plastics where you hit the Scotch-Brite pad to knock stuff off the high points. Sometimes those high points are what are going to get oil or grime or grease the easiest, because that's what oil, grimy, and greasy hands touch first when they move by. But yeah, so leatherworking, I'll do that. Sandpaper, like was brought up, to add scratches to the leather. That can get down to like the bright tan, veg tan interior, I guess. But yes, that's what I'll do for leatherworking normally.
I had a satchel I whipped up for our first Star Cruiser trip, and on that satchel, I wanted to make it look like it got hit by something on accident, like something hot. So I actually took a blowtorch to the leather bag and lit the bag on fire.
Oh, cool!
Because the easiest way to get a burn is to burn something.
Yeah. What we've learned from Christian in this episode is that when he weathers, he just does the thing.
It's hard.
You're just like, I'm gonna just scratch it. I'm just gonna burn it.
Well, I've often found for weathering, the simplest solution is to try and recreate the environment that it would have had it happen. I wanted something once that looked like it was like slightly saltwater corroded. So I actually just mixed up a saltwater spray, and over the course of a few days, we just spritz it and leave it outside, and spritz it and leave it outside. And eventually you get a little bit of that buildup, which when you take it back, leaves a texture that you can only get that way.
That is awesome.
Interesting.
Yeah. Because there's a lot of stuff that, like, as one of the perks of living out where I live in, it's the location I've shot tons of costumes on, is that rocky beach. That is a natural sandstone beach. And the way that the salt water from the ocean and the wind and everything corrodes it, leaves these unnatural, like, jagged, hard edges that you normally wouldn't think to find on a beach where water's constantly running over it. Because you'll get these like incredible like cupping and like almost like barnacle looking areas that is just rock. But so looking at it, it's like, well, that's because it's these three things: wind, salt, and the current that's constantly rubbing away in one spot. So if I can recreate that environment even on like a micro scale, then that'll give me a similar look, right? And it sometimes works. Sometimes doesn't, but sometimes works.
That made you really happy.
That made
as a
me so
geologist.
happy.
I had a rock phase growing up. Okay.
Yeah,
I just never got out of the rock phase.
tough. We all get stuck in one phase or another.
Yeah.
It's so true. Okay, so what about cloth? We haven't really talked about weathering cloth. This is a mystery to me. I have not weathered cloth well. I am afraid of it, so please educate me.
So my Clone Wars Obi-Wan is weathered
Okay.
on the cloth, and that one was really hard to do because weathering cloth does not feel natural to me. Because weathering armor is paint,
Yeah.
but when you come to weathering cloth, it's also paint, but you get like fiber breakdown in a different way. And I'm sure Star has experienced some of this, but it's like you sit there and you look at it. I think Josh has probably also experienced this. I know Hunter did this on his Mando, but it's like you look at like a joint on like a flight suit and you're like, okay, I need to break you down a little bit without actually breaking my costume. How do I do this?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I will use, again, Scotch brake pads to kind of like rough up that patch of fabric. I use a lot of weird stuff to be abrasive on things. I will also use drywall sanding screen. I don't know why, but I like the way that works on fabric. And I don't know if everyone does it this way. I like to weather soft goods with either an airbrush, or Montana makes these really great transparent spray paints. So when you layer it on, because it's not super opaque, it almost ends up looking like it's like poor man's airbrush, basically. I'd like it because I don't have to pull out my compressor and then put the paint in and then clean the airbrush, because that sucks and is super annoying. Some people will disagree, but I just find airbrushes kind of annoying, even though I like using them. They're just sucky to clean.
Yeah.
But yeah, so like after, it's kind of like how you'd weather plastic. Actually, you put on a little more than you'd want, and then you hit it with an abrasive, and it'll take it off of the high points, but leave it in that stitching or whatever.
Yeah.
And that gives you the added bonus of, if you have a pair of jeans that you wear a lot, look at the seam on the inside of your leg, for example, and how that gets kind of fuzzy, because it's always like your legs are rubbing together. Sometimes on the outside of your legs too, or like near your belt loops. It gets sort of fuzzy as it rubs more. And I mean, people wash their clothes usually. I guess not in Star Wars, but a fuzzy area like that's going to hold more grime than a more smooth sheen on fabric. Just like on the hard material, like your weathering is naturally going to build up in areas that have more texture too. So.
Yeah. I think one of the big things for fabric and soft goods especially is that you can't use washes the same way, because a wash is going to just immediately seep through whatever you're working on, and it's going to spread way past where you initially wanted it.
Yeah. It's also kind of terrifying to use washes on soft materials too, because they always look a little bit darker
until they're dry,
because it's wet. So there's been times where I'm like, all right, I'm just going to do a couple of spritzes of wash to make it look like there was at one point a splatter on this, and I'll have it on a spray bottle or something, and I'll spray the material. I'm like, oh God, I just ruined this flight suit. And then 20 minutes later, it's dry and you can hardly see it.
Yeah.
Right. I think, was it Island Fett, who's one of my favorite painters on Instagram.
Yes.
He does wonderful demo videos or story posts every now and then where he's like, here's how I weathered this, like, you know, Mandalorian banner that I was making for a thing. And he's just got 4 spritz bottles of different combinations of fabric dye, alcohol, and water. And it's just him being like, I don't know how this is going to look until it's dry, but sprit the whole thing and then wait. Cool. And then do the next layer and wait. And because once it's in and soaked in, you can't really get rid of it without aggressively cleaning and washing it, at which point you're also going to ruin a lot of the other stuff you want to keep.
Yeah.
I have also used blowtorch on fabric as well. I didn't mention it for leather, but I've done that on fabric. Also, sometimes fabric, if it's a cape or something where it's dragging, where it potentially get caught on whatever you're walking past, you can I've used box cutter or whatever and just make little like cuts at the bottom or whatever. You can kind of use it to artificially make a little hole, and then a sharp object's naturally going to be a pretty clean slice. So a lot of times I will like make the start of the cut and then tear it a little bit bigger because that looks a little more natural. Or like once you cut it, rough up that edge with some type of abrasive material. I found that rasps for like woodworking, those work good on fabric because they're really rough and will kind of pull at fibers a little bit more in a different way than a finer abrasive would.
This is because I recently went on a like rewatch of all the behind the scenes for the extended editions of Lord of the Rings. And one of the things they focus on is like, how do you break down natural like fabrics and materials in costumes? And like, there's a bunch of times where like you don't see it, especially like in a movie, or you won't see it on screen or on a photo. So it might only actually be visible to people that see it in person or who get up close to it. Because like, for example, on the Gandalf the White costume, you think, oh, it's pristine. He's new. He's back. He's got a really clean costume. There's a bunch of small tears and holes throughout that entire garment that are deliberately added there to break up the embroidery that no one's ever going to see on camera. But it's if you don't have it there, it looks too clean on camera. So there's sometimes where you do stuff that, or it's never like people aren't going to like notice that you did it on a photo, but when they see it in real life at like a convention or you're at like an armor party, they're going to see it and be like, oh my God, I never noticed this one detail. This brings the whole piece together even more.
Yep. And even I do kind of think, at least this is my perspective, that even those tiny little details like you're talking about with Gandalf the White, although you can't really like conceptualize it when you're watching it, like you don't see those like tiny little pieces of weathering, you do kind of see it from afar. Like there's something about the costume that still looks lived in, even though you can't see the individual threads. It still looks lived in. And I think that's the same with costumes. Like even in pictures, it's like, oh, it looks clean, but there's something about it that looks real. And I think that's what those tiny little weathering pieces are. So maybe nobody's going to see those tiny little brushstrokes, but they will see the full effect of it. You know,
that's what I was trying to say, but you said it better when I was talking about the splatters on Boba Fett's helmet. You get when I think about Star Wars costumes, the design language of Star Wars, or like especially when you're talking about Mandos, it's color blocking is the way I like to think about it. There's large swaths of color, and it's if you had a little like knob or whatever, and you could crank up the resolution. If it was all the way, and there's some name for this type of minimalist art. But if you cranked it all the way down on the resolution side and you get it to almost like pixel art or whatever, you're going to have just blocks of color, you know? And as you crank that up, that pixel is going to split into more. And the more and more pixels you get, there's going to be a gradient across those. And it's no longer going to be just the average color of that color block. You know, there is some variation there. And even though your brain initially registers it as, hey, Boba Fett's green, that you do have this, it's like a subconscious realization that it's not just all uniform green. There's something more interesting going on here. There's another layer to it. It's kind of like how I don't know, I sort of think about it like shadows almost, or how your brain registers shadows, the way light hits stuff, to give it depth and that kind of thing. I think it's kind of hard to talk about some stuff like this because it's like, how does, like, I can think about what it looks like, but how do you say it?
Yeah, you know, it's really challenging, actually. Yeah.
I mean, so it's one of the things that we were taught in art school when we were working our way through like colors and gradients in color theory, which was like you might look at two different colors and be like, oh, these are like, you know, the same color, but when you like unfocus your eyes and actually bring yourself into looking at them through like a blurred state, you can all of a sudden make out like slight tonality differences. So it might be, oh, these are two of the same blue, but one's actually more green, the other one's more red. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh no, I can actually see it now that this is a warm tone, that's a cool tone.
You know what this is making me think of? And Star and Cap, who are on mute right now, when they come back, they can attest to this. But the game Hues and Cues.
Yes. Oh my God.
Absolutely infuriating for that reason. And I've played it with Cap and Star before, but it's just like that is what the game is about. And in a way,
all color theory.
Incredibly frustrating, but in another way, it's cool to see how people's brains work in that respect. But
yeah, such a good game. It's really, really fun to play with Hunter. I do agree with that.
Hey Hunter, when you come visit, don't worry, I have a copy of that game. We can play.
Fantastic.
Wonderful.
I feel like we're due for a rematch.
Fine. Just as long, I'm gonna say Boba Fett is off limits, and then we're good to go.
I feel like that's what makes it fun. Okay, did we miss any type of material to weather? I got plastic, cloth, metal, leather, foam. Is there anything we should say about foam?
I feel like foam weather's pretty similar to like plastic.
Except you do need to cover it in some kind of plasti dip, because sometimes spray paints will eat the foam,
which is fun.
Yeah,
that can be an intentional thing you might do though. Who knows?
True. That's true.
Right? Again, weird texture that only comes around through one way.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, well then I think my sort of final question I'd like to pose to everybody, and do like actually explain this in some amount of detail, you know, if you want to, but what is the like your favorite thing you've ever weathered, and what makes it your favorite, and kind of like how did you do it? Yeah, I know it's kind of
what a question.
I gotta give it to my Commander Vaughn animated helmet, because that one is the most combination of like applying washes and sanding and overspray with a spray can and like rubbing that back, as well as layering in, you know, with latex and actually sanding back paint to get like the natural scuff marks, while also trying to match a screen reference so you get the right scuff mark in the right spot. Because one of the things like in the 501st with the clone troopers, right, we did, especially with the animated ones, there's a bit of wiggle room with how you weather them. Because you like some Rexes that you see out there for animated Rex are super weathered Rexes, and others are very clean Rexes. But one of the things I always tried to do was try to match at least as much of the feel of what you were seeing, and like the understanding of like, okay, if there is a certain mark in a certain spot, that had to have come in a specific like way. Actually, that was the thing I completely forgot I wanted to mention earlier, which was if you are physically weathering something, like you're adding paint chips to something, you need to think about where those paint chips are going, because there are parts of a costume that are not going to get hit by like debris or shrapnel.
Right.
Yep.
Like something that's on an underside is not going to get as much weathering as something that's coming up from above.
Yep.
Yeah, that's definitely part of the highs and lows side of weathering theory that I was mentioning.
Yeah.
Where if something is really hidden, it's not going to get certain types of weathering, but is going to get others.
Yeah. But no, so for me, my favorite piece is probably my Vaughn helmet.
I have this Vaughn helmet here, this realistic one. This is actually one of my favorite pieces that I've weathered. Well, I'm going to talk about 3 different things because, big surprise, I can't decide. This is one of my favorite pieces that I've weathered because I think it's a really good balance of a bunch of different methods on here. There's washes, dry brushing, latex paint chipping, tape ball paint texturing when it was still wet, dry brushing, physical damage, like basically everything that I knew at the time I used on this helmet, and I think it all came together really well.
Mhm.
So this is one of my favorite pieces. Another thing that is one of my favorites, not necessarily because it's good, but because it taught me a lot, was my first Boba Fett helmet that I painted. That helmet, so it's a Return of the Jedi Special Edition Boba Fett helmet, which is just a slightly more beat up version of the Empire Strikes Back helmet. But that has that super funky layered paint job that I was mentioning, and I clocked it, and I spent about 40 hours just on the paint layering on that helmet.
Wow.
And it did not by any means turn out perfect, but it taught me a ton, and to me was like a really kind of pivotal thing in my journey as a costume painter. It taught me a ton on how to think about things.
Yeah.
And then the last thing I want to talk about, which I guess isn't necessarily something that I weathered. I mean, in general, yes. So my droid S2 that I did, the weathering on him was super, super fun. And that taught me a lot about weathering too, because a droid is weathered very differently than a costume. But there is a specific scratch on him that is my favorite scratch on the whole droid that is not really fully done by me. So right above his radar eye, there is a little X-Acto blade scratch that I made on the corner of one of the pie panels on the top of his dome. And when I did that, it was a very, very fine, literally just X-Acto blade scratch. And I have had him driving around for almost 2 years now. And droids get a ton of crowd interaction, and people like patting him on his head and stuff. But that little bit of detail there in that scratch, it's also in an area that people tend to just pat him on the head a lot. But people see that, and people will come and be like, oh, and they'll like touch that, like they want to feel that. And over the last 2 years, it has gotten so much darker, which is kind of really gross, but also really cool, I think. Study on how people interact with this droid as a puppet or character, and also a study on like how grime builds up on something, because it's like real weathering that was enticed by fake weathering, I guess.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah. Star,
That's awesome.
Josh, favorite things you've weathered?
Oh man. So I think my favorite thing I've weathered is probably the same thing as my favorite thing I've painted, which is my Sev armor. And the reason I put those together is that because the paint is blood, you have to think about what part got smeared, which is actually kind of weathering.
Juicy.
So, yeah, extremely. And then also like what part got darker because it built up, and it is kind of painting, but it's also like partially making it dirtier and smearing it. And I think that goes, we didn't talk about finger painting, and that is like my favorite method of doing anything, is just putting like whatever on my hands.
What is this, preschool?
Yes,
finger painting.
It's like my favorite type, so Sev was the perfect build for me. But I think trying to weather the blood on that costume was really fun. So like trying to think of like, where would it be darker? Where would it be lighter? It was extremely fun. Yeah, that definitely my favorite. But in a more traditional weathering sense, I think my Mando chest plate is one of my favorites, because I did use a bunch of different types of weathering. So I did like the latex paint chipping. I did dry brush. I actually put some like dirt and sand on it and actually like rubbed it in when the paint was still a little wet, to give it kind of a sandy, I don't know. There's pieces of sand in it, is the point.
Well, it creates physical texture.
Box as part of your costume.
Yeah, of course. And it was also fun because I have a script on my actual chest plate, and I wrote it all out super detailed and was very excited about it. And then I didn't know, I couldn't remember where I put the latex. And so it was kind of heartbreaking, but kind of fun to like peel back and be like, I am erasing hours of work right now, which makes that piece part of some of my favorite, just because it was so painful, which was fun. Yeah, a bunch of washes and stuff, and trying to get like a yellow wash on it was pretty fun. So I don't know, those two are probably my favorite because they're kind of unique in that way, I guess.
Yeah. Josh?
There's a 3 1/4 square inch section above my right butt cheek of my Han gun belt that I love beyond belief.
That is such a you thing to say. Go on.
That is very specific. Please elaborate.
I can't explain how I did it, but that little area is it's perfect to me. I there's not really an explanation. I just like it a lot.
It just sparks joy.
It's honestly one of the things I'm most proud of because I like the part of my Han gun belt that is above my right butt cheek. Aside from that, I'm really happy with my Batman cowl, which is urethane that we didn't touch a lot on this episode, but these guys know that I can be kind of insane about details sometimes.
You?
And so I'm increasingly that build specifically was a delving of my insanity. But aside from that fact, working with that cowl had like a beeswax shine on it and oils and clear enamels and acrylics, and I hand sewed the whole thing. That's not the weathering, but it's a mix of a lot of techniques, and a lot of the reason I like it so much is because of the conversations I got to have with people that worked on the film that helped me understand how to do it. So there's a portion of it that I like it because of how it ended up looking when it was done, and a portion of it that I liked it just because of the people that it allowed me to meet by working on that project.
What about you?
Yeah. I think actually the favorite thing I've ever weathered is a DC-17. I should have grabbed it from the basement. I built it for your Mando. And what I kind of had in my head, I might be a nerd, was like, what if this is one of Rex's old guns? And so I kind of like latex weathered like some of those tick marks that is on his armor. And then I weathered that back. And it was just really fun to kind of creatively think through, like, what if this is a really old gun? It's like 30 years old, it's like around during the original trilogy or something. So that was probably my favorite. But the one that I have here that I can actually show you guys is the Hunter helmet. This is my newer favorite. So I just really enjoyed trying to like
Finger paint.
Yeah, I finger painted a lot of this, and it gets that kind of animated style look. So I really enjoyed that helmet. But yeah, so we clearly really like weathering.
Just a little bit.
Yeah, we are super excited about it.
My favorite part of painting a costume is getting to make it dirty.
Yeah. Same.
I think I want like a series of watching Christian like actually weather things.
Yeah.
Like I would watch little shorts of like, this is what he's gonna do now.
He's, like,
he's gonna burn it.
Okay,
I want to see it.
I will happily document my next paint build for
Please do.
And it's like, for this time, I'm gonna actually throw something in the ocean and see what happens when I fish it back out. Like I want to see.
So how did you get the chipping on that shoulder bow? Well, I tied it to a string and then tied that to the exhaust of my car, and then it drove for 16 miles.
I know guys who weathered their clones that way.
Really?
That is
They're clones?
Drag them down the street. Yep.
Jeez.
Christian's like the Christopher Nolan of weathering. He'd actually use an atomic bomb if it just meant getting a proper result.
Oh Lord.
There are some things you can only get through specific kinds of heat.
See, I think Christian, you should do a section called extreme weathering. It'd be great.
Yeah. Yeah. That's
Okay. Well, I'll keep that in mind. I don't
Next
really
up on the
painting for a while.
Patreon series.
Yeah. Next up on Patreon, watch Christian buy hydrochloric acid to weather something.
Hell yeah. Stop.
Speaking of Patreon, we're nearing the end of the episode, so thank you to all of our wonderful Patreon members. Colin mysteriously alluded to new content coming to Patreon, so if you're not yet a Patreon subscriber, you might get new content. You might not, but you might. We
don't
appreciate all of you guys. We do Clone Wars Rewatch every other week if we have time. And we love doing it. And we are very grateful for the support that you guys give. Any closing thoughts from any of you guys, either relating to weathering or other topics, before we end for the night? Good, because I have one. What's not heavy and blue?
What's not heavy and blue?
Light blue. And that's some good color theory to end the podcast on.
Oh,
Have a good night, folks. May the force be with you always.